Chapter 46. None the Wiser. David Milgaard, William Mullins Johnson, Anthony Hahnemann Ayer, Stephen Truscott, Kyle Unger, Romeo Fillion, Guy Paul Morin. A tragic litany of wrongful convictions plagued the Canadian justice system, men falsely accused of murder and caged for decades for crimes they did not commit. Their faces form a dire and haunting portrait of a legal system fraught with injustice, bias, and all too human error. We sit equally transfixed and paralyzed by their nightmarish tales of agony and salvation. The nation's news cameras focus on these exonerated men, but only by widening the lens to include Peter Wheeler does a clearer picture emerge. More than a century on, it appears we are none the wiser when it comes to understanding how wrongful convictions occur. Public perception holds that such mistakes occurred during trial. As the calamitous case of Peter Wheeler shows, the die was cast and the erroneous accusations were made long before the falsely accused set foot in a courthouse. Such tunnel vision is costly. Attempts to right the wrong that focus solely on legal errors inevitably fail to capture the exogenous elements that implicated the innocent man in the first place. Although virtually all wrongful convictions are now overturned through the introduction of cutting-edge scientific evidence, technology cannot address the external factors that wield such portent. Even the most sophisticated DNA testing could not have identified the moment when the press declared Wheeler to be guilty or measured the impact that decades of casual racism had on the jury of his peers. Microscopes could not have detected Nicholas Power's deep-seated insecurities or his pathological need to be right. And erroneous verdicts cut both ways. Judge Ito's jury mistakenly acquitted football legend O.J. Simpson of murder, but the deciding factors in the case began long before the gavel dropped. The courthouse antics were merely the endgame of a judicial miscarriage that started when the first news choppers locked onto the white Bronco creeping along a California highway. More to the point, the mitigating circumstances really began when the first merchant ships arrived in Africa in search of free labor and continued through the dawn of the mass media and the building of a temple to celebrity, in which all were free to worship the god of their choosing. To believe otherwise is to miss the actual catalysts of wrongful verdicts. The true problem remains one of focus. Because the legal system demands it, appellate lawyers stare myopically at trial transcripts, hoping to find an impeachable error, but they are missing the bigger picture. Those metered pages do not reveal the real reasons their client was wrongfully accused, for such social factors dwell outside the courthouse: racism, media manipulations, the force field that is celebrity, a community's need for justice, and police officers with personal agendas. In the pantheon of the wrongfully convicted, Peter Wheeler may be a newer and lesser light, but his is the perfect cautionary tale. By modern standards, errors proliferated during the legal proceedings, but the damage was done long before Wheeler stood in the dock. As summer gave way to fall in that most terrible year, Peter Wheeler was repeatedly passed through the machina carnis of the maritime journalistic cabal. Yet the tabloids alone do not bear the full weight of Wheeler's untimely demise. Some of the burden must fall on Dr. Lovett, whose well-intentioned naivete led to that first intractable proclamation of guilt. Even greater iniquity rests on Detective Nicholas Power, who cared more for preserving his aura of infallibility than the pursuit of true justice. Some measure of blame must also be shared among those witnesses who manipulated the truth to seal Wheeler's fate with their malleable testimony, including Bernard Parker and his magical footprints, his brother Herbert, who turned Wheeler's locker room banter into a motive for murder, and Hardy Benson, whose ever-changing tale shoved Peter headfirst into the crime scene. In the end, there was ample blame and shame to go around. The system failed Peter Wheeler, delivering a verdict that was not justice but simply mindless vengeance. And, if the system failed Wheeler, the media failed the system and society. The Fourth Estate proclaimed itself the ultimate seeker of truth, the last bastion of fidelity and candor. Self-appointed as society's watchdogs, journalists were supposed to keep the lawmakers honest by exposing corruption and wrongdoing wherever it may reside. Modern-day balladeers, the media profess to chronicle the exploits of the great and small, kings and everyman, sinners and saints. But, as they will be the first to tell you, the market wants the sinners, not the saints. The adventures of the virtuous do not move much ink. At the very least, the media should have reported the facts accurately and objectively. In this regard, the tabloids failed miserably. By favoring verisimilitude, the editors and reporters lost sight of their higher calling, opting to wallow in the mire for the sake of the bottom line, peddling half-truths and outright fictions for a few measly shekels. As we toss yet another unwanted local circular into the recycling bin, it borders on the ridiculous to think that the Digby Weekly Courier ever wielded such power or influence. It is hard to believe that a local paper, with its part-time reporters and limited circulation, could have ever held a man's life in their feeble grasp. But in the decades before broadcast radio or television, and more than a century before the birth of the Internet, newspapers reigned supreme. They scripted rather than recorded history, and all the news that was fit to print was disseminated according to their agendas and political bents. The local tabloids not only informed the citizenry, they controlled it. Newspapers had a stronger hand in shaping public opinion than any other social institution, save for the church. Born of such a tainted journalistic womb, the myth that Peter Wheeler killed Annie Kempton has survived longer than most other old wives' tales. After his execution, the doubters and heretics who refused to toe the party line of Wheeler's guilt eventually fell silent and were all but forgotten. A sparse and dusty court docket book records only that he was tried, convicted, and hanged in accordance with the law. A century on, the only public record of Peter Wheeler remains the one limned by the media. It is a portrait reminiscent of the works of the great master Pablo Picasso, which feature a vaguely recognizable subject that is beautifully disturbing yet an unambiguous distortion of reality, a once tangible solid taken on an entirely artistic flight of fancy. It is well past time to set the record straight. It is, in hindsight, almost too easy to see how it happened. Despite his discernible innocence, things never looked good for Wheeler. There was no escaping it. Wheeler was an African-born man in the snowy white confines of the Switzerland of Nova Scotia. Worse still, he had never learned his place. He had the temerity to live in proximity to an innocent white girl and the gall to be friendly to her. Wheeler, who was among the last to see her alive and the first to find her dead, had signaled his guilt to all those predisposed to see it. Anyone that needed further proof of his reprehensible nature need look no further than his unholy relationship with Tilly Comeau, a white woman reputed to have questionable morals. And what of Wheeler's morals? In a land where a well-thumbed Bible was the hallmark of piety and righteousness, Wheeler preferred to spend his days lost in the heathen words of Shakespeare and Tennyson, blasphemously forsaking all organized religion in favor of a self-guided spiritual journey. What was the town to make of such a man? How could anyone have ignored all these signs pointing to his guilt? There is no denying that Peter Wheeler was far from perfect. His was not a guileless life and he was not deserving of accolades or reverence. He sometimes enjoyed a casual relationship with the truth and was rootless and untethered, an outsider in a land anchored by family and community. But a second glance reveals another set of truths. Wheeler had no say in his ancestry or how his physical appearance was judged or interpreted by others. He could not help the circumstances of his birth or control the era in which he found himself, replete with its mythology of demonic criminals and the super sleuths who waged war against them. He held no sway over the media and their portrayal of him. Peter never cast himself as a victim or begged for the nation's sympathy. He possessed no great wisdom and offered no profound insights into the mysteries of life, save this: he did not kill Annie Kempton and he did not deserve to hang for her murder. Should you ever lament that the system favors the accused at the expense of the victim, recall well the saga of Peter Wheeler, a man stripped of all rights or any hope of a fair trial. Not only was the system at odds with Wheeler, it was clearly aided and abetted by a media wholly unbridled by the constraints of journalistic integrity or the forced protections of libel laws. Among the so-called favors lavished on the defendant was the right to a speedy trial. Swift justice was originally intended to protect the wrongfully accused from languishing in perpetuity without due process. It is a noble and vital tenet of our practice of jurisprudence, yet, if Peter Wheeler teaches us nothing else, there is a razor-fine line between swift justice and a rush to judgment. Time is the enemy of those incarcerated, but it is the saving grace of those unjustly accused. In the wake of heinous and inhumane crime, the emotions of the afflicted community run high. Passion obliterates reason and the thirst for vengeance drives otherwise sane men to desperate and sometimes unconscionable acts. The difference between David Milgaard and Peter Wheeler is that the former lived long enough to see justice done and Wheeler swung before cooler heads prevailed. Like laws and sausages, the mechanics of crime and punishment are best left to the public's fertile imagination. In the case of Queen v. Wheeler, the law's viscera have been flayed open for all to see. Such forthright disclosure reveals an empty vessel. There was no evidence, no smoking gun, no irrefutable proof. There was merely fear and supposition tinged with xenophobia and a healthy dose of racism overheated by a news media hungry for a homegrown story to rival the Ripper. And what a story it was! Reporters tripped over themselves in their mad search for superlatives to describe the horrific act. Wheeler was dubbed a wretch of the deepest dye, quaint Victorian and albeit harsh words at the time. Florid excess was the fashion during the reign of Alexandrina Victoria, and gonzo journalists of the day heeded the trend with narratives dripping with glorious surfeit and nugatory extremes. The sad tale of Annie Kempton and Peter Wheeler runs the gamut of negative and painful emotions: fear, prejudice, lust, deceit, cowardice, indifference, insecurity, an unfathomable rage. And through it all, the one common thread was the media's reptilian embrace, a fetid clutch that chilled even as it feigned concern. Duplicitous, exploitative, and mercenary, the Maritime's earliest tabloids eagerly fed on the all-too-raw emotions of victims and villains alike. There was no subtlety, like vaudeville, it was designed to entertain by appealing to the lowest common denominator. The editors contended they were merely giving the people what they wanted, in spite of their own oft-voiced disdain for such reprehensible subject matter. Then, as now, we get the media we deserve. Flash forward to modern day. Digby bears no trace of the short life and brutal death of Peter Wheeler, no gravestone denotes his final resting place, no historical plaque was affixed to the jail or courthouse. All of the relevant institutions have been demolished or rebuilt in the intervening decades. Little from Wheeler's time survives and nothing of Wheeler himself, no descendants, no siblings, no recognized heirs. In contrast, the village of Bear River pays ample homage to its fallen daughter Annie, as many no doubt feel befits their respective roles of perpetrator and victim. The case lingers, familiar as the scar of a wound long healed. Yet for all that has been written about Peter Wheeler and his part in the crime of that century, after all the trials, inquests, and tribunals and in the wake of an execution made all the more public for its feigned secrecy, one question still haunts Bear River more than 110 years later: who really killed Annie Kempton?